She was denied her rightful table at a restaurant she helped fund. But when her husband uncovered the truth behind the erasure, the entire elite institution was forced to face a reckoning. What began as quiet humiliation turned into a national conversation on justice, visibility, and reclaiming power. This story will leave you speechless and inspired. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. They say the air feels different in places you were never meant to enter. I didn't believe that until I stood in my kitchen, staring down at a heavy ivory envelope with my name etched in gold. It was the kind of invitation that didn't just invite, it dared. Inside, nestled between embossed cards and perfumed parchment, was a formal summons to the birthday celebration of Madison Langley, age 6, daughter of Richard and Eleanor Langley. Hedge fund royalty, old money, old rules. And right beneath that, printed in crisp serif font, was the venue. Le Chien Argenté. I knew that name. Everyone in the city did. It wasn't a restaurant, it was a gate disguised as a glass palace, a place that didn't exclusivity because it spoke fluently in whispered glances and unspoken codes. I turned the invitation over in my hand as the morning light cut through the blinds, washing the room in pale gold. My husband Raymond had mentioned this party 2 weeks ago, somewhere between our risotto and the late news. They asked us to come, he'd said casually, like it was nothing. I said yes for both of us. He hadn't looked up from his plate. I remembered smiling faintly at that, unsure if it was amusement or annoyance bubbling up. You didn't ask me, I'd said. Didn't need to, he replied. You deserve to be seen. Raymond Hughes never used words carelessly. At 52, he was the kind of man who didn't walk into rooms. He shifted them. Most people knew him as a private investor, the silent partner behind several luxury brands, restaurants, real estate firms. What they didn't know, what he never boasted, was that Le Chien Argenté was one of his crown jewels. He owned 61% of it, but kept his name out of the paperwork. His hands clean, his presence hidden. He always said you learn more watching people when they don't know they're being watched. I was 48, a professor of ethics and cultural philosophy at the university downtown. I'd spoken on panels about equity, sat on commissions about inclusion, and mentored young women through glass ceilings no one liked to admit were still there. I was used to moving through rarefied spaces with grace, always aware of how my skin entered before my resume did. But this wasn't a lecture hall or a foundation gala. This was social territory, private school circles, old-line wealth that dressed itself in vintage pearls and untraceable judgments. And yet, I chose to go. Not to perform, not to prove, but to be present. I told Raymond I'd arrive early. He had meetings stacked back to back that day, and he didn't question it. He only leaned over his coffee, brushed a kiss to my temple, and said, "Wear the white one." So I did. It was a soft, flowing white dress that skimmed my hips with quiet assurance. No designer logos, no heavy jewelry, just a pair of nude heels, simple pearl studs, and my wedding band. I wore my natural hair swept back into a low chignon, controlled, intentional, mine. I didn't want to blend in. I just didn't want to ask for permission. The Uber dropped me at Le Chien just past 3 p.m. The building glittered under the afternoon sun like a temple made of chrome and light. The valet opened my door without hesitation, but I still caught the flicker of his eyes. Not malicious, just curious, calculating. It was always the same, split-second evaluations in spaces like this. Who are you? Do you belong? Do you own? Or do you serve? I stepped out anyway, spine tall, chin even. The marble floors inside reflected every step I took. The chandelier overhead looked like frozen fireworks suspended in breathless motion, casting golden halos onto the curated crowd already sipping champagne. Laughter tinkled like fine crystal, and the scent of truffle oil floated through the air like a signature meant only for the chosen. At the hostess stand stood a young woman with a name tag that read Rachel. Blonde, thin, efficient. The kind of smile that had been trained more than felt. I stepped forward with the same calm I used when addressing a disinterested academic committee. "Good afternoon," I said. "I'm here for the Langley party. My name should be on the list. Alma Hughes." She blinked, turned to the leather-bound reservation book, and began flipping. I watched her finger move down the names like a judge at a pageant. Then she paused. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. I'm sorry, she said. I don't see that name listed. I tilted my head gently, my voice still warm. It's there. My husband Raymond Hughes confirmed it directly. We were invited by the Langleys. He reserved table 7 by the garden window. Rachel gave a tight smile. One moment, please. She whispered to another hostess, then looked at me again, her gaze unreadable. Our manager will be right with you. So I waited. 5 minutes. 10. I watched guests pour in. Blonde mothers in linen, men in pale blue sport coats, little girls in tulle dresses and gold ballet flats. One couple was greeted with hugs. Another was led straight to a private lounge with a nod. Then I saw her, Victoria Langley. She swept in like a gust of silk and self-importance, in a crimson dress that hugged her like an accusation. Her heels clacked like declarations. Rachel straightened instantly. Miss Langley, welcome. Table 7 is ready. I turned. Excuse me, I said softly. That table was reserved in my name. Rachel didn't blink. Miss Langley is a regular. That table has been hers for weeks. I don't remember what I said next. I just remember the man who appeared behind Rachel, Brent, the manager. Tall, suited, perfectly groomed. He looked at me like I was a misplaced napkin. Unfortunately, that table is unavailable. We can seat you by the kitchen. The kitchen. I felt something in my ribs shift. Not snap, just a line. I looked around at the crowd, all so polished, so practiced. I wasn't angry yet, but I was something sharper. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't make a scene, I just stood a little straighter. I made sure he saw me. All of me. Because when you've built a life being mistaken for less, sometimes your greatest power is simply not shrinking. They didn't know who I was. Not yet, but they would. Raymond was on his way. I stood by the grand entryway, the sound of soft jazz trickling through hidden speakers, the scent of white lilies hanging in the air, like a reminder that beauty was meant to be controlled, curated. The lobby of Le Chien Argenté was designed to seduce you into forgetting where you stood. Everything from the velvet banquettes to the burnished brass fixtures whispered refinement, but beneath the gleam was something colder, something older. 10 minutes. I had stood there for 10 full minutes while couples walked in and were greeted like royalty. While Rachel, the hostess, flicked her eyes toward me only once, and even then, it was the way you might glance at a maintenance sign, an inconvenience, not a guest. I didn't shift my weight or glance at my phone. I stood still, anchored. Every second felt deliberate. A silent message, I'm not leaving. Then came the final insult, wrapped in practiced indifference. A tall man in his 40s, sleek dark hair, a tailored navy suit that screamed control, stepped up beside Rachel. His name tag read Brent Saunders. The kind of name that sounded like it came with Legacy Club access and a summer home in Connecticut. He looked me up and down, not with hostility, but with something worse. Appraisal. Like I was an unfamiliar variable in a space that ran on predictability. Mrs. Hughes, he said with a polite, empty smile, I understand there's been some confusion regarding your reservation. No confusion, I replied evenly. My husband made the reservation. Table 7, by the garden window, confirmed last week. Brent nodded slowly, hands clasped in front of him like a pastor delivering bad news with grace. Unfortunately, that table is currently occupied. We'd be happy to seat you near the kitchen. It's a quieter section of the dining room. The kitchen. I blinked once. My hands remained by my sides. My voice didn't rise. I'm sorry, did you just offer me the table by the kitchen? Brent's expression didn't change. It's quite comfortable. Secluded. Secluded. Removed. Tucked away like something to be handled discreetly. The way you might hide a stain from the front room when guests arrive. Around us, the space continued humming. Silverware clinked. Servers glided past with trays of rosé and smoked trout canapés. A little girl in a Dior dress skipped past holding a balloon shaped like a swan. No one looked at me directly, but they knew. You could feel it. The slight tension in the air, like when someone breaks a rule in a room that runs on silence. I felt my jaw tighten. My mother always said grace doesn't mean staying quiet. Sometimes it means refusing to be small. I stepped a fraction closer. Brent's eyes twitched. That table was reserved under my name, I said, each word steady, and given to someone who arrived after me. He shrugged lightly. Mistakes happen. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the performance was so familiar. The polite deflection, the nothing to see here professionalism, that was polished just enough to gaslight you into doubting your own reality. And then I saw her, Victoria Langley, perched at table 7 like a smug monarch. She was sipping sparkling water from a crystal flute, legs crossed just so, eyes sliding lazily across the room before they landed, predictably, on me. Her lips curled, just a little. Not a smile, a smirk. I assumed it was first come, first served, she said, loud enough to be heard, her voice dipped in satin and superiority. My mouth didn't move, but something inside me burned. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about a table. It never was. It was about who the room was designed to include and who it was engineered to exclude. The glass doors at the front whispered open again, and I caught the sound before I saw him. A quiet hum, too smooth to be anything but electric. The Tesla. Not just any Tesla, Raymond's. Everything shifted, like someone had adjusted the lighting in the room by a single degree. Heads turned subtly, posture straightened, servers glanced toward the door, and even Rachel seemed to pause mid-sentence. He entered with that calm, measured walk of his. No theatrics, just presence. A charcoal suit molded to his frame like it had been sewn directly onto his name. No tie. Just confidence. His skin caught the chandelier light and turned it molten. And when his eyes found mine across the room, I didn't move, but the fire that had been simmering inside me finally found oxygen. He didn't need to ask what happened. He knew. In 4 long strides, he crossed the floor, the polished marble reflecting his steps like an omen. He stopped beside me, his eyes still locked on mine, voice low, calm, and laced with danger. "You've been standing here this whole time?" I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I just glanced toward Brent. Raymond turned, slowly, as if pivoting required calculation. His eyes landed on Brent like weights. "You gave away the table my wife reserved?" Brent hesitated, already retreating mentally. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding, Mr. Hughes. We didn't realize." "That she was my wife?" Raymond's voice didn't rise, but it cut. Brent stumbled. "We had a last-minute request from a longtime guest, Miss Langley." "She had no reservation," Raymond interrupted, "but she was given priority." I can assure you." "No," Raymond said sharply. "You can't." The room was no longer pretending not to watch. Conversations had thinned, glasses were frozen mid-air. I could feel the discomfort radiating in all directions. Not for me. For themselves. Because the illusion had cracked, and no one could look away from the fracture line. Raymond took a step forward. "Let me be very clear. You didn't just disregard a guest. You erased a name from a list because you decided it didn't belong." Brent's throat worked hard. There was no intention. "But there was impact," I said suddenly, voice calm and deadly. That made Brent look at me. "Really looks. You handed me a erasure wrapped in etiquette," I added, and expected me to smile while I was being vanished. No one spoke. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, still sipping, still pretending, but the smirk had vanished. She wasn't smug anymore. She was exposed. Raymond turned to the room, not theatrically, but deliberately. "This," he said, "is why I never put my name on the building, because I needed to see what happens when I'm not in the room." He paused, scanning faces. "Now I am." He looked back at Brent. "And you've got 1 hour to call every member of the board. We're having a meeting, tonight." Brent blinked. I think we can resolve this without." "We're beyond resolution," Raymond said coldly. "Now we deal in reckoning." And just like that, the tables turned, literally and figuratively. He held out his hand to me, palm open. I took it. Not in submission, in solidarity. And we walked, not to a corner, not to a compromise, but straight toward table 7, toward the seat they tried to erase. And this time, no one tried to stop us. We walked toward table 7 like it was consecrated ground. Every footstep we took across the marble echoed louder than any outburst could have. The clink of glasses, the faint jazz tune, even the hum of whispered judgments all faded into the background. There was only the hush, the unmistakable hush that falls when a room realizes it has misread the moment, misjudged the players, and now must witness the consequences. Victoria Langley was still sitting at table 7, her back as straight as her posture could manage, hands curled elegantly around her flute of sparkling water. She didn't look at us until we were 2 paces away, and when she finally did, her smile flickered like a candle in wind. Thin, fragile, a defense more than a greeting. "I didn't realize this table was such a point of contention," she said lightly, her tone soaked in aristocratic indifference. I assumed it was open seating. I stopped just beside her. You assumed wrong. Raymond didn't glance at her. His hand was still resting gently against the small of my back, calm but unyielding. He looked down at the table, then up at her. You're in the wrong seat. Victoria's smile faltered. She adjusted her posture, brushing invisible lint from her lap, as though the act of rising would somehow make her noble. If it means that much to her, she said, the last word sharpened with subtle insult, I suppose I can be gracious. My voice came before I had time to temper it. No, not gracious. Correct. I felt the air shift again. Behind us, diners had all but stopped pretending to carry on with their meals. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A woman at the next table had her phone in her lap, screen dimmed, clearly recording. No one said anything, but everyone heard everything. Victoria stood slowly, the chair scraping slightly as it moved. She didn't look at me. Not directly, but her voice was just loud enough for nearby tables. We're all learning our place today, aren't we? Raymond exhaled through his nose. Quiet, dangerous. He held out the chair for me, and I sat, not with a smile, not with triumph, just with certainty. This was my seat, and it had always been. Brent appeared then, hovering like a specter near a pillar, his smile stretched thin as if it had been ironed into place under pressure. Mr. Hughes, he began. You may not, Raymond said without turning. The phrase sliced through the air like a scalpel. Brent froze. His mouth worked, but no sound came. Instead, he gave a curt nod and turned toward the bar, signaling a waiter with urgency. You could feel the shift ripple through the staff like electricity. The illusion of control had shattered, and now everyone was moving on instincts. Survival, mostly. I looked out the window, letting the green of the garden calm the churn in my chest. It wasn't over. Not even close. Because while the confrontation had made them stare, the reckoning would make them reckon. Isaiah, one of the servers, approached with 2 menus and shaking hands. Young, mid-20s, warm eyes behind a veil of nervousness. He placed the menus down and murmured, "Welcome, Dr. Hughes, Mr. Hughes." The way he said it, careful, reverent, reminded me that he had seen it too. All of it. Raymond simply nodded, then reached for the glass of still water that had been preset. He took a slow sip. His other hand remained resting on the white linen tablecloth, fingers curled loosely, relaxed in posture but firm in spirit. I leaned back in my chair. This table had cost me more than a reservation. It had cost me visibility, dignity. And for 10 minutes, it had tried to strip away years of resilience and render me invisible in a room I had helped finance. But now, sitting here with my name reclaimed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt anchored, seen. The calm didn't last. Brent returned. This time he brought 2 security guards with him, discreet in their black suits, their eyes darting like they'd just stepped into a courtroom instead of a restaurant. Their presence alone was enough to ignite whispers around the room. Raymond didn't move. I narrowed my eyes. Really? Mr. Hughes, Brent began again, trying to sound composed. We've had a request from another guest to de-escalate the situation. Perhaps it's best if we relocate Dr. Hughes to another area. Raymond straightened his posture just slightly, the motion nearly imperceptible, but sharp enough to draw the guard's attention. Are you suggesting we move my wife because someone is uncomfortable with her sitting at her own reserved table? Brent hesitated. It's merely a courtesy suggestion, sir. My voice came out low, but clear. Let me understand this. After denying my reservation, offering me a seat by the kitchen, and handing my table to a woman who walked in after me, your solution is to move me? No one answered. I turned my gaze on the guards. One of them shifted his weight from foot to foot. You want them to drag me out? Because I promise you, I've survived worse than this velvet-lined circus of selective civility. Brent paled. Raymond stood. His presence seemed to grow 10 feet taller in that moment. Now you understand, he said to Brent. From this moment on, we're not speaking as manager and investor. We're speaking as 2 men on opposite sides of a lawsuit. The word lawsuit hit the room like thunder. A fork clattered to the floor somewhere to our left. Brent's mouth opened, then shut. Raymond leaned forward. You didn't just offend a customer. You enacted a policy. An unwritten, practiced, and systemic one. And now you'll answer for it. I watched Brent shrink in real time. The once polished professional now looked like a man whose script had ended, and the stage lights were still burning. You want this to go away quietly, Raymond continued, but it won't. Not anymore. The security guards stepped back slightly, as if physically removing themselves from the side they were told to stand on. They weren't here to protect dignity. They were here to protect a hierarchy. And now that hierarchy was crumbling. I exhaled. Not relief, just clarity. Raymond returned to his chair beside me and spoke in a tone that was quieter, but carried more weight than any shout. You have 1 hour, he told Brent. Clear your schedule. We're meeting with the board. And don't even think about touching the reservation system. We already have a copy. Then, he placed his hand gently on mine. Not as comfort, as alliance. I looked down at our joined hands. They had tried to reduce me to a name that didn't fit their list. But now that name had power. Now that name sat exactly where it was supposed to be. Table 7 wasn't a seat anymore. It was a line. And they had crossed it. The restaurant never truly recovered its rhythm that night. It tried. God knows it did. Waiters still carried silver trays with curated bites, and the pianist in the corner resumed a cautious medley, hoping to distract the crowd from the thunder that had just passed through. But the air? It was heavy now, brittle. Every whispered exchange at neighboring tables was sharper, tighter, like everyone had realized they'd been sitting comfortably in someone else's exclusion. And the temperature had changed. Brent had vanished somewhere past the wine cellar. The security guards, once stationed like sentinels, now lingered by the back hallway, pretending to be absorbed in earpieces that had long since gone silent. Meanwhile, Raymond and I sat at table 7 in absolute stillness. We didn't need to perform. We didn't need to speak. The room was doing all the talking for us. Our waiter, young, anxious, and far too polite, brought over 2 fresh glasses of wine. No comment, no pleasantries. Just 2 stemmed offerings placed with trembling care. But as he turned to go, I noticed something small and folded beneath my napkin. I picked it up and opened it slowly. 4 handwritten words. You weren't the first. I stared at them, the curve of the handwriting looping with urgency, almost shame. Raymond leaned over, glanced at the note, then looked at me. His expression didn't change, but something in his jaw tensed. Then he spoke, low enough only I could hear. Then, it's time we make sure you're the last. And just like that, the evening was no longer just about me. It had become something else, something larger. It wasn't about a table, it was about what the table stood for. Access, respect, the illusion of belonging that cracked the moment someone dared sit down without the right kind of pedigree, the right kind of profile, the right kind of polish. Raymond took out his phone and sent a message. 1 tap. No hesitation. Within minutes, Rachel, the assistant general manager, arrived at our table, posture stiff with apology. Her dark-rimmed glasses couldn't hide the nervous flicker in her eyes. She greeted Raymond with the kind of controlled smile that people reserve for royalty and earthquakes. Mr. Hughes, she said, her voice a notch too high, how can I assist? He didn't even look at her. Tell the board we're meeting tonight, 7:30. Everyone. No exceptions. She blinked. Tonight, sir? That's very short notice. Exactly, he replied. And tell Brent he's expected to attend. But not as a manager, as a man with questions to answer. She nodded quickly, then disappeared back into the heart of the machine. I sat there for a moment, watching her retreat, the words still echoing in my head. You weren't the first. It wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one who had been erased with a smile and a shrug. I wasn't the only one who'd been offered the kitchen after showing up in good faith. This place had a pattern, a ritual. And tonight that ritual had been interrupted. Raymond looked at me then, really looked. You okay? I nodded, but there was fire in my throat. I'm not angry, I said. I'm exhausted. He nodded, as if he understood all the weight packed into that one sentence. You won't have to carry it alone anymore. At 7:25 p.m., the guests in the main dining room were being served dessert. Delicate confections shaped like flowers, spun sugar that looked like frozen lace, all presented with perfect poise. But beyond a frosted glass door labeled staff only, something very different was about to be served. The boardroom at La Chaîne Argentée was pristine, minimalist, intimidating. Polished obsidian table, 12 leather chairs, soft recessed lighting that was meant to impress, not comfort. It was a room where people talked about margins and luxury demographics, not ethics or humiliation. Tonight, that would change. Raymond sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, posture loose, but only to the untrained eye. I knew him, knew the way his stillness meant strategy, knew how his silence was never empty. It was a test, and they were already failing. The board members filed in, suits pressed, eyes cautious. Some knew what was coming, others had no idea. All of them, however, looked at Raymond with the kind of mixed emotion usually reserved for courtrooms, respect tangled with fear. And then Brent walked in. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last hour. His portfolio was clutched tightly under one arm like a shield. He didn't speak. He simply found the only empty chair, purposely placed at the farthest end of the table, and sat. Alone. Raymond didn't wait. "This emergency meeting is being held under Clause 12, he began, his voice calm, firm. "Gross misconduct requiring immediate executive review." One of the older board members cleared his throat. "Raymond, surely this isn't necessary. It was an unfortunate misstep." "Yes. But this wasn't a misstep," Raymond interrupted. "It was a culture, a practiced one. And tonight, we stop pretending it doesn't exist." He tapped the small black control panel built into the table. The lights dimmed slightly, and a projector descended from the ceiling like a silent eye. "Let's talk about what the paper trail doesn't say." The screen lit up, spreadsheets, color-coded, time-stamped, clean and cold. "In the past 6 months," Raymond continued, "there have been 17 documented cases of minority guests either being delayed, denied, or erased from our reservation system. In 12 of those cases, the seats were reallocated to white guests who arrived later without reservations." A collective inhale swept the room. "And in every single one of those cases," Raymond said, turning his gaze on Brent, "override access was used. Access only management possesses." Brent opened his mouth, but Raymond raised a hand. "No excuses. No spin. Just answer this. Did you override the reservation for Table 7? Brent's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't remember." Raymond pulled a paper from his jacket and unfolded it slowly. "This is the system log. It shows that at 2:48 p.m., you replaced the name Hughes Alma with Langley Victoria. And it wasn't the first time. No one moved. No one defended him. The data was too clear." Finally, Brent broke. "You think this is easy?" he snapped. "Keeping this place exclusive? Maintaining standards? You don't understand what it takes to run." "I understand exactly what it takes," Raymond said coldly. "And I also understand what it costs when exclusion becomes policy." He placed another document on the table, thicker, stapled. "This is your termination notice, effective immediately." Brent stood up as if to protest, then realized no one else was rising with him. Not one hand extended, not one voice defended him. He left the room quietly, and the door clicked shut behind him like a gavel hitting wood. Raymond looked around the table. "We rebuild from here," he said. "Transparency, accountability. And we don't wait until lawsuits and press leaks force our hand." The board members nodded slowly, some out of duty, some out of fear. But for once, they weren't the ones holding the pen. Outside the boardroom, the rest of the restaurant buzzed on, oblivious. But the ground beneath them, it had just shifted. The morning after the board meeting, I sat on our terrace with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the skyline stretch into a soft blue haze. There was a calm over the city, the kind that only comes after a storm, not because the damage is gone, but because everything is still too quiet, too freshly changed to make noise again. Raymond joined me minutes later, tablet in hand. He wasn't a man of small talk in the mornings, but today he didn't have to say much. One look at his screen told me everything. We were front-page news. Vivra-linked restaurant accused of systemic erasure, investor takes stand. The headline was bold, sharp, unapologetic. The story had leaked overnight, likely from someone inside the boardroom. Maybe Rachel. Maybe someone on the waitstaff who had lingered just outside the door. It didn't matter. The details were too specific, too honest to be rewritten. They included my name, my table, my refusal, and Raymond's line that now felt burned into the fabric of this city. "We're no longer negotiating, we're reckoning." The article spread like wildfire. Within hours, influencers who had once tagged themselves smiling beneath La Chaîne Argente's chandeliers were issuing public statements, some awkward, some ashamed. A few offered apologies, most offered distance. The Yelp page, once filled with praise for the foie gras and wine list, began to morph. Story after story poured in, some calmly written, some furious. One read, "My mother showed up with her Sunday best and still got seated by the swinging kitchen door. I thought it was bad luck. Now I know better." Another, "I was told my reservation wasn't found. It was my birthday. We left without eating." And then the one that stopped me cold. "I used to work there. I was told not to overwhelm the guests with too many people who didn't match the vibe." I didn't last a month. Raymond closed the tablet and placed it on the table like it had become something too hot to hold. "It's not just our house anymore," he said. "It's the whole block." Later that afternoon, a blog post appeared on the university's website, under my name. I hadn't written it with the intention to go viral. I hadn't written it for spectacle. I just needed to say it. When you have to fight to be seen in a place you helped finance, you begin to understand that exclusion wears many faces. Some smile, some whisper, some wear uniforms and offer you a table by the kitchen, but silence is never neutral. It wasn't meant to be poetic. It wasn't meant to be political. It was just true. And the truth, when given a platform, spreads faster than a lie. Within an hour, the post had been shared over 10,000 times. By nightfall, my inbox had changed. So had my voicemails. I had notes from law students, from nonprofit leaders, from exhausted women in HR jobs who had been fighting invisible walls for years. And one from a woman in her 70s who wrote, "I didn't think people cared about women like me anymore. Thank you for proving me wrong." Raymond's phone didn't stop ringing either. His staff fielded requests from media outlets, ethics panels, city officials, even the mayor's office. They wanted meetings, statements, public alignment, but Raymond wasn't interested in talking. He was interested in building. At 5 p.m. sharp, he stood at the entrance of Vivre Blanc, the restaurant still trying to carry on with normalcy, though you could feel its bones creaking under the new weight of awareness. The main dining area buzzed on as usual, but the private dining hall, that was reserved. Not for guests, for the staff. Every employee had been summoned, not to be reprimanded, but to be heard. There were no uniforms required, no wait trays, no hierarchy, just seats, evenly spaced, just voices, unfiltered. Raymond stood at the center of the room, no suit, no branding, just a dark sweater, sleeves rolled, hands in his pockets. "Some of you," he said, "have seen what this place became. Some of you lived through it. Some of you benefited from staying quiet. I'm not here to punish anyone, but the culture ends tonight." Silence. Then, Isaiah, now with a small silver name badge that read Head of Guest Experience, raised his hand. He didn't look angry, just ready. "I was passed over for a promotion twice," he said. "When I asked why, I got scheduled for closing shifts for 3 months straight." Raymond nodded once. "You're safe now, and you've already been promoted. That won't be reversed." Another hand rose, then another. And then they came faster. Stories spilled from corners of the room like slow, pent-up storms. A hostess recalled being told to smile more, but not too much. A dishwasher admitted he had never been told he mattered to the brand. A sous chef said she used to watch guests get turned away for wearing natural hair, and when she spoke up, her hours were cut. I watched from the back, heart aching, chest swelling, not with pride, with purpose. Because this wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning, and reckoning has a way of waking ghosts from the marble floors of places built on performance. By the end of the night, Raymond announced a sweeping list of reforms. AI-assisted reservation tracking to detect bias patterns, anonymous reporting channels for staff to voice concerns, mandatory equity training, led by an independent ethics board, quarterly audits with public summaries. Some called it radical, others called it risky. But guests, real guests, the kind who had been denied before, called it right. And then came a call no one expected, Veronica Langley. Her voice was brittle but composed. She didn't offer an apology, she offered calculation. "My family wants to make this go away," she said. "We'll donate, we'll release a statement, we'll even support your new initiatives if it stops here." Raymond paused, then replied with 2 words. "It's begun," and he hung up. There was no joy in his eyes, just clarity. That night, as I stood once again outside Vivre Blanc, watching the city breathe under amber light, I knew something had changed. Not just for me, not just for us, but for every person who had ever walked into a room and been told, through silence, through smiles, through slighted glances, that they were a mistake. Raymond appeared beside me, not speaking, just standing. We didn't need to say anything, because now the city was talking for us. And the sound of progress? It wasn't loud, it was steady, and it wouldn't stop. 1 week later, just before sunset, I stood in front of Vivre Blanc again. This time, there were no nerves. No silence to swallow. No reservation log to clutch like proof of existence. There was only presence, mine, and the steady warmth of the man beside me. Raymond had his hand resting lightly in mine as we stepped out of the SUV. He wore a slate gray suit, no tie, effortless. I had chosen a simple ivory silk dress, my curls cascading over my shoulders. No statement jewelry, no designer bag, just me, visible in every step, unhidden by artifice. The valet didn't rush to greet us, not out of disrespect, but reverence. Because tonight was different. The doors to Vivre Blanc no longer stood as a test. They had become a threshold, one I crossed not to prove, but to lead. Just inside, Isaiah waited. His black blazer was embroidered with the restaurant's crest now, and beneath it, in gold thread, were 3 words that made my throat tighten. Head of Guest Experience. He had grown into the role already. His shoulders were straighter, his smile calm, not deferential, just dignified. "Dr. Hughes," he said, voice low and full of something more than welcome. "Mr. Hughes, your table is ready." I nodded. "Thank you, Isaiah." He didn't gush, didn't perform gratitude. He simply stepped aside and let us pass. 2 people returning not as exceptions, but as standards. The dining room had changed. Not in its glamour, no, the chandeliers still glowed like constellations, the marbles still shined, and the glass still framed the garden like a painting. But something deeper had shifted. The energy. Gone were the icy stares, the careful performance of wealth. In their place I felt something warmer, something stillness couldn't fake, awareness. Eyes followed us, but not with skepticism, with recognition. As Raymond and I walked through the hall, a couple at the next table nodded to me respectfully. A woman at the bar smiled, placed her hand to her heart, and mouthed, "Thank you." Not for drama, not for spectacle, for permission, for proof. Table 7, our table, sat unoccupied near the window, dressed in fresh white linen, framed by candlelight and a bouquet of white peonies. And beneath the table number, engraved into a discreet brass plate on the side of the pedestal, were 5 words that caught the light as we approached. The Hughes table, reserved always. Isaiah pulled out my chair with gentle care, and I sat, not with hesitation, not with pride, just peace. Raymond took his seat across from me, glancing at the setting sun outside the window. "This time," he said softly, "you lead the conversation." I smiled faintly. Not because I needed to win, but because I already had. Our server approached then. Natalie, a young woman I recognized from before. She looked nervous but determined, holding the menus close to her chest like they held more than meals. "It's an honor to serve you both," she said, placing the menus down. "Chef Amari asked me to let you know, tonight's menu is inspired by women who lead without raising their voice." My eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite a theme," she blushed. "He said you'd understand." Raymond and I exchanged a look, the kind that said, "They're listening now." I opened the menu. Each course was named after a woman who had changed something quietly, irrevocably. Writers, activists, scholars. A dish called Simone's Silence, a dessert named Reclaiming Grace. It was subtle, but it was everything. Halfway through the meal, Isaiah returned, not with wine but with a small black envelope. He placed it on the table between us, then stepped back, letting the moment breathe. Inside was a framed print of our original reservation confirmation, dated, time-stamped, digitally archived. The document that proved the table was always mine. It had been placed in the system under Hughes, Alma, Table 7, Garden View. I held it gently in my hands, the edges smooth beneath my fingertips, the symbol of all the ways they had tried to erase me, the receipt of their failure. Raymond lifted his glass. "To the ones who came before you, and the ones who will never have to fight this battle again." I raised mine in return. "To the table that wouldn't let me disappear." We clinked, and the sound was not just a toast, it was a declaration. Behind us, where portraits of vineyards once hung, there now stood a new installation. A black and white photograph of a woman sitting at a restaurant table, her profile turned toward the light, unbending. The plaque beneath it read, "Table 7, where elegance rewrote the rules." Guests walked past it and paused, some murmuring, some staring. They didn't need to be told who she was. The room already knew. And when the check came, delivered in a gold-trimmed envelope, it held no total, just a note. On behalf of every future guest who will never again be told they don't belong, thank you. Raymond didn't say a word. He simply slipped it into his pocket like a promise. As we rose from the table, I noticed the staff straighten their posture. Not stiff, just proud. Guests turned. Conversations softened. Not from fear, from reverence. I walked out the same doors that once marked my exit in shame. But this time the wind felt different. It didn't push. It carried. Outside, the city glowed beneath us, and in the hush between streetlights and starlight, I knew what had shifted. Not just a policy, not just a restaurant, a standard. And I had helped write it. In the days that followed our return to Vivre Blanc, something extraordinary began to unfold. Not with fireworks or headlines, but with steady, unshakable momentum. It started in whispers. Reposts of my blog, quiet conversations on university steps, murmurs in conference rooms and group chats. But soon those whispers turned into questions. And the questions turned into action. The media didn't let go. They followed the trail, eagerly. Not just because of Raymond's name or my quiet presence in academia, but because something about the whole ordeal struck a nerve far deeper than a table reservation. It was about the slow erosion of dignity. One reservation, one erased name, one withheld acknowledgement at a time. And people had stories. Vivre Blanc became a symbol, not of luxury, but of reckoning. And not just in hospitality, in tech, in fashion, in media. I watched it happen from my office window at the university. I'd sit with a cup of tea, scrolling through emails from strangers who no longer felt strange. There was the young woman in Austin who worked the door at a private jazz club and had been reprimanded for her afro being too expressive. She wrote, "After your story, they changed the dress code, quietly. But they changed it." There was a hotel manager in New York who admitted his team had long been accidentally overbooking guests with ethnic names. He didn't ask for applause. He just said, "We're correcting our system." Because it never was a glitch. It was a choice. And then there were the invitations. Not to banquets or panels, but to help design something better. I received a request from a coalition of restaurateurs across the country. Independent owners who wanted to audit their own spaces. They didn't want PR. They wanted blueprints. Raymond, who had stayed relatively quiet through it all, finally said to me over dinner one night, "They're looking to you, Alma. Not for noise, for standards." He placed a folder in front of me, 3 cities, 3 inquiries, 3 business leaders asking, how do we build spaces that don't rely on erasure as the default? I looked at him, heart full. Then we give them one. But they have to understand, the standard isn't the table. It's the courage to stand beside it. That week, my guest lecture on ethics in emerging systems was renamed by the university's ethics board. Without asking me. The new title? The Geography of Power. Whose table is it anyway? Attendance tripled. Students lined the walls, sat on the floor. I saw young women in business suits and young men with notebooks full of questions. A few older community members from town even snuck into the back row. I spoke not about scandal, but about architecture. How systems are designed, not stumbled into. How omission is often policy dressed in politeness. I wasn't asked to leave, I told them. I was offered a seat by the kitchen. That's how most bias enters, not as a door slammed shut, but as a whisper that says, "Could you maybe sit over here instead?" A hand rose from the second row. A young man, maybe 20, shy eyes, firm voice. "Do you think it's changing?" he asked. "Or are people just reacting?" I paused, thinking of Isaiah, of Natalie, of the framed confirmation still sitting on my desk like a piece of war memorabilia. And then I said, change doesn't always look like protest. Sometimes it looks like policy. Sometimes it looks like no one flinching when a black woman walks into a luxury space with nothing but her name. And sometimes, change means you never have to ask that question again. He nodded, quietly. The room exhaled. Outside the lecture hall, I saw a few professors standing by the entrance. One of them, an older white colleague from the philosophy department, gave me a look I hadn't seen in years. Not approval. Not pity, but recognition. Later that evening, Raymond and I returned home to find a courier waiting by the gate. The envelope was thick, the wax seal unbroken, the return address stamped in gold. It was from Eleanor Langley. I opened it carefully, expecting, what? An apology? A denial? A donation pledge? Instead, It was 2 lines. We underestimated you. The room will remember you longer than the wine list. May it never forget. It wasn't an admission, but it was close. Still, I wasn't looking for apologies. Apologies are momentary. I was looking for accountability. And that had already begun to sprout in places I hadn't even expected. Isaiah began holding weekly staff dialogues at Vivre Blanc, not workshops, dialogues, a space where grievances, ideas, and dignity could live side by side, where silence wasn't enforced and deference wasn't required. Natalie, the server who had once stammered through her introduction, was promoted. She now trained incoming hosts on customer experience, not just etiquette, but awareness. And Raymond? He stepped down from silent ownership, not out of protest, out of purpose. He stepped into visibility. He joined task forces, met with entrepreneurs, shared data. He no longer wanted to be the man in the background watching for injustice. He wanted to help rebuild the blueprint from the inside out. He told me one night, as we sat on our balcony again, we spent years walking into rooms thinking we had to prove we belonged. But the truth is, we were the ones carrying the room. I looked at him and said, then let's redesign it. And we did. It started with 3 cities, then 5, then more. Not franchises, not fame, but frameworks. Places where policy didn't rely on silence, where respect was built into the walls, not reserved for the privileged. We helped consult on new restaurant openings, rewritten employee manuals, even software systems that could flag patterns of discrimination. And through it all, I never forgot the note beneath the napkin. You weren't the first. That line haunted me, empowered me, guided every choice, because it reminded me the story wasn't mine alone. It belonged to the woman who was offered the seat near the kitchen and said nothing. The young man whose resume got him the job, but not the welcome. The professor who walked into the private gala and was handed a coat check number instead of a drink. The Hughes table wasn't a monument. It was a mirror, and the reflection was finally changing. Late one evening, after the last of the city's light had melted into deep lavender shadows, Raymond and I stood inside the now quiet dining hall of Vivre Blanc. The space was empty. No guests, no music, just the ambient hum of dimmed lights and the faint scent of lemon polish lingering on the tables. But tonight, the stillness didn't feel sterile. It felt earned. He ran a hand along the edge of table 7, the Hughes table. It had been etched into the reservation system permanently now, not as a throne or symbol of privilege, but as a reminder of the night the illusion cracked and something truer was born. Beneath the polished wood, a discreet brass plaque gleamed softly, where respect rewrote the rules. Raymond didn't speak for a moment. He just stood there, one palm flat against the table's surface, as if listening to the echoes still trapped in the wood grain. I don't want my name on a wall, he said finally. I want this room to remember what happens when silence ends. I moved beside him, my heels clicking softly against the stone floor, and rested my fingers on the same edge. It will. It already does. He looked at me, eyes steady in the low light. I thought I'd hate walking back into this place. I smiled faintly. I did too. But now, I feel like I finally own the silence. He nodded. Not own, he said. He rewrote it. We stepped out onto the terrace, just beyond the tall glass doors. The city below pulsed gently, cars weaving through downtown, a few horns in the distance, the occasional sparkle of laughter echoing from rooftops. The wind swept over us in a slow, measured breeze that felt less like weather and more like a breath the building had been holding in for years. I leaned on the railing and looked up at the stars. Do you think it'll last? I asked him, voice quiet. Raymond didn't answer right away. He took a long breath, letting it settle in his chest before speaking. It'll evolve. Some will resist, some will perform, but enough people will remember, and that's all you need to shift the axis. We stayed like that for a while, just breathing in what we had built. Not an empire, not a brand, something quieter, something more resilient. The kind of change that doesn't need to shout because it's rooted too deeply to be shaken. Inside, staff gathered their belongings. The new sous chef, a Vietnamese woman named Lin, had left a note on the counter, scribbled in looping pen just before she clocked out. I hadn't read it yet, but Raymond had. He handed it to me gently, folded in thirds. I opened it slowly. Thank you for building a room that finally fits me. I didn't say anything, just smiled, and let the weight of those words land wherever they needed to. Raymond stepped back inside, heading toward his office. I lingered near the entrance, letting my eyes sweep across the floor plan that once excluded me so smoothly it almost felt surgical. But not anymore. Raymond returned moments later, holding a leather-bound folder. "These are from the task force," he said. "Proposals, expansion plans, requests for consultations in 3 more cities. They want to replicate what we did here." I glanced at the folder, then back at the room. "Then give them one," I said. "But make sure they understand. The standard isn't the decor. It isn't the menu. It's the courage to stay at the table, even when they're told they don't belong." He nodded slowly. "That's the blueprint." The following Monday, change rolled through the city like a tide no one saw coming, but everyone felt. Small businesses started re-examining their policies. Restaurants reviewed their reservations. High-end salons began rewriting their dress codes. Quiet shifts, no press releases, just accountability. A luxury spa in Seattle rewrote their intake forms after a guest pointed to a clip from my university lecture. A hotel in Atlanta introduced bias detection software in its booking system. No statement, no fanfare. Just a quiet apology baked into the new code. It wasn't a revolution with fire. It was a redesign in form. And every time I heard about another change, another ripple, I remembered that moment at the door, holding a reservation in my name while being told it didn't exist. I remembered how Rachel's smile had felt like a velvet slap, how Brent's tone had tried to shrink me, how Victoria's smirk had nearly unseated my dignity. Nearly, but not completely. Because now that table was not just reclaimed. It was transformative. One afternoon, while walking across campus, a student stopped me in the hallway. A young black woman, barely 20, with hair in tight braids and eyes lit with something that made my chest tighten. "I saw the article," she said. "And I just wanted to say, I don't think I'll ever let anyone make me invisible again." She didn't wait for me to respond. She didn't need to. She walked away like someone who had just remembered her worth. Later that day, I returned to my office to find a new email waiting in my inbox. The subject line was simple. "Table 7, still reserved?" It was from a former Vivre Blanc hostess, one who had since quit and started a hospitality consultancy of her own. She wanted to collaborate. She wanted to teach people what she had learned, about bias, about belonging, about how the little things are never little. I replied, "Always reserved. Let's talk." That evening, I cooked dinner at home, something simple. Rosemary chicken, grilled asparagus, no cameras, no meetings, just peace. Raymond came in late, jacket slung over one shoulder, smile soft. "They approved the audit system," he said. "Isaiah's implementing it across all locations, full transparency. Monthly reviews, anonymous reporting lines." I turned off the stove and leaned back against the counter. "That's the thing about justice," I said. "It doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it just walks quietly behind the scenes and rewrites the script." He smiled. "You make justice sound like a playwright." I smiled back. "Maybe it is." That night, as we watched the city wind down from our bedroom window, I thought of the ripple we had started. Not because we shouted, not because we sued, but because we stayed. We insisted. We named the thing and refused to shrink in its shadow. And somewhere, across town, in some restaurant or hotel or gallery, someone else would sit down at a table, not knowing they almost weren't allowed to. And they'd be served, respected, welcomed, never realizing that once, someone had to stand still, speak up, and stay visible so they could simply be. That, I thought, is how the world changes. Not all at once, but one table at a time. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in this journey resonated with you. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. This wasn't just a story about a table at a restaurant. It was a story about dignity, about what happens when someone is told, again and again, that they're not welcome, that their presence is an exception instead of a right. But more importantly, it's a story about what can happen when we refuse to accept invisibility, when we choose to speak truth in rooms designed to silence us. The lesson? Never let anyone convince you that quiet injustice is too small to challenge. Because change often starts not with noise, but with one person saying, "No, not this time." Now I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? What part of this story stayed with you the most? If this message moved you, please subscribe to our channel. We have many more real, powerful stories coming your way. Stories that make you feel, reflect, and sometimes even rethink everything. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never give up your seat.